Today I'd like to talk about the Lombards in Italy, and here is what is called the Iron Crown of Lombardy. It is made from plates of gold and precious stones which have been fastened to an inner rim of iron, and this inner rim of iron is apparently fashioned from one of the nails used at the crucifixion. It is Lombard workmanship from the 8th century. It was then passed via Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, and also a king of Lombardy by conquest, into the possession of the Holy Roman Emperors. And I believe that each emperor was crowned with this crown. It is what you could call barbarian workmanship from the 8th century, though I think you'd agree that the phrase barbarian workmanship doesn't mean much. It is Italian workmanship from the 8th century, and it has played an important role in the transmission of authority over a large part of Germany and northern Italy between about the 8th century and the beginning of the 19th century. So this is the Lombard crown. And let us talk about how the Lombards came into Italy. Here is what you can call the Empire of Theodoric the Great. This is Italy in 535, just before the Byzantine Reconquest. Although backward projections from the Middle Ages call the time of Theodoric a golden age, it does seem to have been one of those historical sweet points that you occasionally get for a country. What you have is no substantial social or cultural change from the days of the Western Empire. You have a continuing imperial administration in Italy, the continuation of the senatorial aristocracy, and Rome continuing as a large and prosperous and very populous city. At the same time, the taxes are much lower than they were at the time of the Western Empire, because Italian money no longer needs to be funneled north to protect the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Italy is now protected by the Alps and by a set of buffer territories which prevent invasions from the northeast. The Italians do not need to raise armies of their own or to serve in armies, because defence is in the hands of the Goths. The Italians carry on with their rather pleasant lives. Italy is at peace. Italy is prosperous. Italy is defended by these buffer states, which are garrisoned by the Goths, who do not interfere with them. Italy is also on very good terms with all the other barbarian kingdoms in the West. It's on good terms with the Franks in France. It's on good terms with the Visigoths in Spain. It's also on good terms with the Vandals in Africa. And it remains on good terms with the empire based in Constantinople. So Italy is prosperous, at peace. Its cities are large and prosperous. If you had turned up in Italy around the year 530 and looked for evidence of the fall of the Roman Empire, you would find very little in the way of evidence. If you went to Rome, you would see no great change. The population may have been smaller in about 500 than it was in perhaps 300. On the other hand, it might not have been. It might have been smaller in 500 than it had been in 100, but it might have been larger than it had been in 300. Whatever the case, a question about the survival of the great public buildings in Rome. As far as I can tell, Rome in about 500 looked completely unchanged. There had been two sacks. There was the sack that Alaric mounted in 410, But he was in Rome for about 3 days. They burned one or two buildings. They took a great deal of movable wealth, but movable wealth is easy to restore. Buildings can be reconstructed or the sites can be redeveloped. Gaiseric spent 14 days in Rome in 455, but he went as a collector. His plundering was more a question of, I want that, let's have it. Not, let's burn this down and see if there's anything left afterwards that we can put in our pockets. No, Gaiseric turned up with his army, and doubtless a large number of Romans from North Africa saying, yes, we believe that in this building there are these objects, so we'll have those. Afterwards, he went away, leaving the buildings intact, the people unmassacred, and a very wealthy senatorial aristocracy which was looking through its palaces and saying, oh dear, that nice silver table that I got from my grandfather, that's gone. Never mind, I'll have another one made. So by about 500, Rome has recovered from these two rather civilized incursions. It wasn't like the Gallic sack of Rome in 390, where the city was burned. It was nothing like the Crusader sack of Constantinople in 1204, where about a third of the city was burned down. These were looting expeditions, and they were rather genteel looting expeditions. The last one was a looting expedition by a group of men who knew exactly what they were looking for, who found it and took it away and left everything else untouched. So yes, you'd have found that Rome was still Rome. The buildings were still standing. The temples had been locked up. They had been closed in 395. Some of them had been repurposed as churches. Some of them were locked up. They'd been given rather basic maintenance, but the question was, well, what to do with these? They're too magnificent to destroy, but the Temple of Jupiter is too magnificent to destroy it. We don't want to let it fall down, but it's also too small to turn into a church, so we'll think about it. And there's enough money to give it basic maintenance. But again, if you turned up in Rome in about 500, and certainly in the 530s, all the aqueducts were still pouring water into the city, all of the main public buildings were still standing, and so far as they had a purpose, they were still in use, and the fabric of Rome and the population of Rome was pretty well unchanged from the imperial period. Paganism continued as an undercurrent. It went largely underground from about 410 onwards. There was an attempted pagan restoration in Rome after the Gothic sack, but this was suppressed. The imperial authorities and the church in general, these were pretty well uninterested in paganism. That war had been won. There was no danger of a pagan restoration. This had been tried throughout the empire as a whole by Julian the Apostate, and he died, I think, in 363. There was an attempted pagan restoration in Rome in 410, which was a failure. After that, everyone knew that paganism was dead. It was a diminishing prejudice in certain aristocratic households, and it continued in the countryside, but the priests were now going into the countryside as missionaries and gradually converting the common people. So paganism, no danger. There are laws against it, and if someone stands up and says in public, I attended a sacrifice last night, we sacrificed a goat to Diana, then you might find yourself in serious trouble over that, or you might get a rap across the knuckles. The real danger for the authorities was heresy, and the authorities were hunting out various kinds of heresy with much greater enthusiasm than they ever showed for the suppression of paganism. Paganism was recognized as a dead force, and if it continued in private among certain people, as something that took place between consenting adults in private, the authorities were not greatly inclined to interfere. So that's Italy around 535. Another question, this one about the baths. Oh yes, the baths were still operating, everything was still working. As I said, the aqueducts were still there, bringing in millions of gallons of water every day into Rome, and all of the bathhouses were still in full operation. The whole fabric of ancient life continued in Rome, in Ravenna, in Naples, and in every other large city in Italy. There had been no destruction of the built environment of antiquity by the incursions of the Goths. Alaric and Theodoric and all of the other Goths who had carved out positions for themselves in Italy, or had tried to carve out positions, they had done no substantial or no lasting damage, or no damage at all indeed, to the fabric of ancient life in Italy. The disaster took place between 535 and 568, the Byzantine Reconquest. This led to 5 sieges and captures of Rome. On one occasion, the entire civilian population of Rome was kicked out of the walls so that the defenders didn't need to share the food. The aqueducts, taking all those millions of gallons of water into Rome, were cut. Some of them were reconnected thereafter, but most of them were not. A discussion arising from this point. Yes, the destruction of the built environment in Rome. For example, on one occasion, when the Goths were making attempts on the walls, the Greek defenders pulled a large number of precious statues off their plinths and threw them down onto the defenders, and the broken remains of the statues were dug out, pushing towards 900 years later in Renaissance Rome. If you had visited Rome in 530, you'd have visited ancient Rome. If you'd visited Rome in 540, you'd have visited a stinking set of ruins. So it's not between 535 and 568. It's between 535 and, let's say, 545. That is when Italy passed from late antiquity into the early Middle Ages. You have these armies rampaging through Italy. It is an extraordinarily bitter war, and I said a few weeks ago that Totila, the Gothic king, at one point got hold of the entire senatorial aristocracy and murdered the lot of them. He then murdered their children. Their property was confiscated and distributed to the peasants, which rather nice for the peasants, let's face it. But it was a brutal war, a destructive war. But we must try to disentangle that from the effects, the probably much greater effects of the Justinianic plague. You have a number of very serious climatic events or natural events in the 530s and 540s, which led to a decline of the Mediterranean population by about, or to about, 40%. We're not sure how many people died in those events during that 10-year period, but it was a very large proportion of the population of the Mediterranean world, and this would have happened even if Justinian had not been sending his armies all over the West in an attempt to reconquer it. But it was not made better by Justinian's forward policy. But whatever the case, by 568, Italy is a fundamentally transformed country. The senatorial aristocracy has been destroyed. Rome and all the other cities are in radical decline, the possible exception being Ravenna, which is the continuing imperial capital in Italy. Most Latin literature that we have lost was lost during this period, 535 to 568. Although, as I've said, we should not put too much emphasis on the wars in Italy or on Justinian's government of Italy thereafter. We should try to look at those much larger natural events. You must look at the way in which Justinian ruled Italy after he had reconquered it. He fastened on Italy a number of tax-gathering officials, people like Alexander the Scissors, and his name, I think, says everything you need to know about what kind of person he was. Men like Alexander the Scissors, who were sent to Italy to combine fiscal rapacity with personal corruption. One of Alexander's favourite devices was to get hold of anyone who still had money to take, or might have some money, and to demand an exact accounting of all dealings during the previous 3 generations with the Goths. And if the relevant documentation could not be provided, and it never could be provided, then very large tax assessments were thrown at those individuals. Presiding over this was Narses the eunuch, the conqueror of Italy once Belisarius had been withdrawn. And here is an alleged portrait of Narses. Eunuchs generally have full heads of hair, but they don't have 5 o'clock shadows very often. That's my understanding at least, and this does not look like a eunuch, but I am assured that this mosaic does represent Narses. It doesn't matter. He was a man of considerable ability. He conquered Italy. He beat the Goths. He was then appointed civil and military governor, or exarch, and he ruled Italy from Ravenna. He seems to have done his best. There is evidence of some rebuilding works in Rome, chiefly the walls of the city and various military defences. But it seems that Narses, during his time in Italy, presided over a broken country. The past has been abolished, and nobody knows what the future will be. The end of Narses. The truth is, we don't know what happened to Narses. He vanishes from the literature. He vanishes from the verifiable historical literature after about 550. But there is a story told in Paul the Deacon, which is a very good story, and it's worth repeating, that in 568, the new emperor in Constantinople, Justin II, he was Justinian's nephew. He decided to recall Narses because the man was seen as too independent, or he was seen as past it. He seemed to have been about 96 at the time. It's very difficult to suspect a man of 96 of harbouring independent ambitions, but, well, Byzantine emperors could be a little paranoid at times. But the story is that the wife of Justin II sent a golden distaff to Narses in Ravenna saying, "You are required to come back to the city where you will find much better employment overseeing the spinning in the women's quarters of the imperial palace," a reference to the fact that Narses was a eunuch. Narses then apparently stood up. He looked at this distaff and said, "I will spin these people a thread so long they will never see the end of it." He then sent a letter to the Lombards, who are lurking beyond the northern frontiers of Italy, which Narses had kept secure during his time there, inviting them in. Sure enough, the Lombards did burst into Italy, and that was the end of Byzantine rule over Italy. The other story, or various stories, is that Narses died in Ravenna in extreme old age. His body was shipped back to Constantinople, where it was given a state funeral attended by the emperor and empress. I don't know which story is true. Both may be false, but I know which one I prefer. There is a mosaic from Ravenna around 560, and you should always look at these things because It cannot be the case that everybody in Italy around 560 was in a state of shock and horror at the destruction of their civilization. Life does carry on, and here is a group of people playing Ring a Ring of Roses, aren't they? Whatever the case, Narses is the last ruler of a united Italy. The Lombards, these are the people invited in by Narses. Who are they? Various accounts. My own favourite is given by Paul the Deacon, one of the great writers of the medieval period, and here is a portrait of him, and he may even have looked like that because this was produced not long after his death. According to Paul, the Lombards start out in Scandinavia quite a while before the birth of Christ. They then spend many centuries wandering around, all moving steadily but very slowly southward. And a number of stories in Book 1 of Paul. His belief is that the Lombards start out as a Scandinavian tribe called the Winili. In about 150 AD, they encountered the Vandals, who were still in Northern Europe at the time, and the Vandals, who were numerically superior, demanded tribute from the Lombards. The Lombards then said, no, we will never pay tribute to anyone. Better to die free and in arms than live as tributary slaves. At this point, the Norse god Odin got involved in the dispute between the Lombards and the Vandals, and he said that he would give victory to whichever side first appeared at dawn outside the window of his palace. His wife Freya then made an agreement with the Lombard women that the Lombards would all turn up, and because there weren't many of them, the wives would turn up as well, with their hair arranged in such a way that they appeared to have beards. So the Lombards would all turn up. Odin, who doesn't seem to have had very good eyes, would have looked at this large number thinking, oh, that's quite a large and respectable number of Lombards. My students suggest at this point that I should listen to more Wagner. Ah, of course, yes, I'd forgotten about that. Yes, only one eye. Yes, I should have thought of that. I do like Wagner. Odin looks out of his window, sees this large number of Lombards, and says, oh, who are those people out there? Such long and pretty beards. On account of that, Odin does grant them victory in the resulting battle, but on account of that, the Lombards changed their names from Winili to Langobardi, which is a Latinized version of whatever Longbeards is in Lombardic. Indeed, Longobardi, something like that. Probably something rather close to Langobardi and Longbeards. But that is apparently how the Lombards got their names. Paul relates this story, but as a good Christian doesn't believe it. But like Herodotus, he has a good eye for a story, and this is not a story that he will suppress because it's too good. Anyway, whatever the case, the Lombards are part of the mix of Germanic barbarians wandering through Central and Northern Europe. Now, the Lombard conquest of Italy, 568, they burst into Italy. The Byzantine forces are completely overwhelmed. There is no way in which they can defend the whole territory of Italy. What they do is they keep these pinky areas. They keep the area around Ravenna because these can be protected by a very powerful Byzantine navy. They keep Rome, and they keep a bit of territory running between Rome and Ravenna. They also keep these southern areas because these are very heavily Greek. They appear to have been heavily Greek since about 700 BC, and the Lombards are unable to get into the extreme south of Italy. I keep on saying that whenever you look at these maps, you must not take them as exact representations of the facts on the ground. These borders would shift rapidly, sometimes in a matter of days, and there may have been times when this strip of land between Rome and Ravenna was entirely overrun. But this is the broad situation in Italy by about 600 AD. And here is a story from Paul the Deacon. When Alboin, he's the Lombard king, when Alboin entered Pavia, his horse fell in the middle of the gateway and could not be gotten up, although urged by kicks and afterwards struck by the blows of spears. Alboin had vowed that he would put all the people to the sword because they had been unwilling to surrender. After he broke this vow and promised mercy to the citizens, his horse straightway rose, and he entered the city and remained steadfast in his promise, inflicting injury upon no one. Then all the people gathering around him in the palace which King Theodoric had formerly built began to feel relieved in mind, and after so many miseries were already confident in hope for the future. It seems that once again the ordinary people of Italy, or the people of Italy, welcomed the barbarians after the barbarians had behaved in a rather barbarous way. There is much evidence of plundering and general destruction as the Lombards move in. Within a very short time, the Lombards and the natives appear to have reached an agreement, even if a tacit agreement, which is that the Lombards will take over the government and the defence of the territories, and the native Italians will be allowed to get on with their own lives. And this would explain why the Lombards were able to take over so much of Italy and why they were able to hold it for several hundred years. And when they did lose it, it was not to another reconquest from Constantinople, it was instead to another barbarian invasion. Or let's not talk about barbarians. The Lombards lost out eventually when Charlemagne walked in and conquered them. But until then, the Lombards ruled most of Italy. A question: whether the often light colouring of Italians in Renaissance portraits has anything to do with possible Lombard ancestry. Yes, the barbarians had generally light colouring. Then again, in antiquity, the Italians had rather light colouring. If you look at statues of the early emperors, if you look at busts of Augustus, of Tiberius, of Nero, these are all men with dirty blonde hair, or in Nero's case, red hair. And of course, if you look at modern Italy, in the south, people can be rather dark, but in the north, they look like Central Europeans. The Lombards brought in a further mix of light colouring. Although the Lombards came as plunderers, they stayed as conquerors and then stayed on as rulers, and very quickly, it seems, a set of arrangements came into being which were very similar to the arrangements between the Goths and the Italians. All the Italians appear to have wanted was a local strongman who would protect them against outsiders and let them get on with their own lives. The Goths were that par eminence, and the Lombards, after a period of raping, looting and murdering, appear to have taken on the same functions as the Goths, though in a much poorer and a much less numerous Italy than had been the case. There's a wonderful story about the death of Alboin. Alboin, a great military leader and somebody who helped to integrate the Lombards into Italian life, but he still had a number of rather questionable customs, and one of them was that he had beaten his father-in-law in a battle and had killed his father-in-law and had the man's skull made into a drinking cup. when he was drunk, which appears to have been quite often, he was in the habit of offering this cup to his wife to drink from. And one day in Italy, as king of the Lombards in Italy, he had a longer dinner than was usually the case, and got very, very drunk, and again offered this drinking cup to his wife Rosamund. And she thought, right, I've had enough of this. If you look at this picture, which I think is from a Look and Learn book, his wife Rosamund looks rather worn down by it. She's got a rather Joan Simsy look on her face. Anyway, Rosamund decided this is too far. He's humiliated me once too often. And so she decides to get rid of him, murder him. So she goes into a conspiracy with the king's squire and his foster brother, and then they need the help of a man called Peredio, who is one of the main military leaders of the Lombards, and he wouldn't get involved. Every time they approached him, he said, no, I want nothing to do with this, nothing at all. So Rosamund decides, I know how to do it. Peredio was carrying on an affair with the Queen's dressing maid. One night, the Queen sent the dressing maid about other business and got into her dressing maid's bed. And Peredio came in rather tipsy and in the dark, and they had sex, and Peredio didn't notice. Oh, you're not my usual mistress. Who are you tonight? But after they had finished their business, Rosamund turned up the lamp and said, look, you've just committed adultery with the king's wife. If you don't do as I tell you, the king will kill you for this. You know what he's like. So she brings him into the conspiracy. The conspiracy is this. The Queen takes Alboin's sword in his scabbard and stitches it tightly to the bed so that it can't be drawn. So one night the conspirators break into Alboin's bedroom. He grabs for his sword, can't get it out of the scabbard, and he defends himself very strongly with a footstool of all things, but eventually, well, that's the end of him. Alboin is killed. Everyone is very sorry to see him go, and he's buried under a flight of stairs next to the palace, a rather strange place to put him. Rosamund and her lover then, well, they decamp from Pavia, which has been made the Lombard capital, and they manage to get as far as Ravenna, where they're taken in by the exarch, and they live out the rest of their lives, which does indicate that once again the Byzantines are up to something. It looks like they've been pulling strings in their usual way. After Alboin, the Lombards do not fall to pieces. They cannot be driven out of Italy, but the centralized Lombard monarchy is diminished for a generation. There is a general tendency among the Lombards, as among all these barbarian kingdoms, for the central power to be rather weak, and for anything but the most energetic and able of kings not to be able to keep the kingdom together. That's the end of Alboin, as told in Book 2 of Paul the Deacon. A very entertaining and circumstantial story, which almost certainly contains a great deal of the truth. A suggestion that it might have made more sense to poison him. Yes, I know, but the barbarians didn't like poisoning. They preferred to do their killing face to face. It's a rather Greek thing, the poisoning, but the Byzantines almost certainly had a hand in this matter. Over the next century, the Lombards have a tendency towards localism, or that's a rather nice way of saying a tendency towards political disintegration. And this is why the Byzantines were able to hold on to as much of Italy as they did. And the Byzantines were not a complete nullity. In 653, the Exarch of Ravenna was able to march with an army all the way to Rome, arrest Pope Martin I, and send him off as a prisoner to the east. This is because the Pope is refusing to have anything to do with the Byzantine government's attempt to sort out the Monophysite controversy in the East, which is yet another dispute over the nature of Christ. Martin I is sent a declaration. He looks at it and says, I won't subscribe to this is heresy. So the Exarch arrests him, has him bundled off to Constantinople, where he is mistreated and later dies. And then, about 10 years later, yes. But let's carry on talking about the Lombards. They enter Italy largely as pagans, with a scattering of Arian Christians. But very quickly, within a generation, the Lombards convert directly from paganism to Catholic Christianity, and the Arianism of the Lombard upper classes crumbles very quickly. By about 620, 630, within about 50 years after the Lombard invasion, there are no religious differences between the Italians and the Lombards, and the Pope finds it very easy to make deals with the Lombards. The papacy and the Lombard kings are always rivals for the domination of Italy, but there is none of the business that you get from religious divisions between the Lombards and the Italians, or the Lombard kings and the popes. So the Pope is willing to treat the Lombards on an equal footing, and the Lombards rule large parts of Italy from Pavia or Milan, or simply as local strongmen, as with the Duke of Benevento in the south. Right, 653, the arrest of Martin I. 663, Constans II, a rather strange emperor, with some rather strange personal habits. If you look at the map of the Mediterranean world around 650, you can see that the Arabs have taken away Syria and Egypt, leaving the empire with its core territories and North Africa and bits of Italy. And Constans, who is hated by the citizens of Constantinople, decides to move his capital to Syracuse. And since he's now in Syracuse, he might as well reconquer Italy and drive out the Lombards. He does invade Italy. There's a coin representation of Constans. According to Paul, Constans turns up in Italy and goes to a certain hermit who is credited with oracular abilities and says, "Will God let me kick the Lombards out?" And the hermit says, "Give you a night to think about it." And then the hermit says to Constans, "The Lombards cannot be overcome in any way, because a certain queen coming from another province has built the church of St. John the Baptist in the territories of the Lombards, and for this reason St. John himself continuously intercedes for the nation of the Lombards." One of the subtexts in Paul's history is that the Lombards are not an alien incursion into Italy. They are part of God's plan for Italy, and the Lombards and the Italians are rapidly forming into a single nation. This may be propaganda, but it may also contain a great deal of the truth. What is undeniable is that Constans II invades Italy with a large and probably adequate army. Constans himself is no fool when it comes to military matters, and yet Constans makes zero headway in Italy. He does turn up in Rome in 655, and here is the account in Paul the Deacon. Constans, the first emperor in several centuries to go there, turns up in Rome. He is met by the Pope and what remains of the Roman people. They come out 6 miles along the Appian Way. They meet their emperor and they escort him into the city. Constans remains in Rome for 12 days, during which time he does not behave like an emperor. he behaves with a great deal more rapacity than the two barbarian invaders did, Alaric and Gaiseric. What Constans does is he strips everything made of metal from the buildings of Rome. He takes the gilt bronze tiles from the roof of the Pantheon, which about 40 years earlier had been turned into the Church of all the Apostles. And when the Pope says, "You've just stripped the roof off the biggest church in the city," Constans' answer is, "Oh, well, you've still got the bronze tiles on the roof of the Temple of Jupiter. I can't be bothered to take those, so you can put those on." The roof was taken from the Temple of Jupiter, used to patch up the Pantheon, and so the Pantheon still exists, but the Temple of Jupiter is now a ruin. So Constans turns up in Rome. He plunders the city more ruthlessly than any previous invader has done. He then marches off. The story in Paul, which I don't give in that blue box, is that the tiles were taken off to Sicily and they were meant to be shipped east to Constantinople. Instead, there was a raid by Arab pirates and they took it all away and melted down for coins. Constans is eventually forced out of Italy by Lombard armies and by a complete lack of support from the local people. They are not interested in seeing Italy once again as the westernmost extremity of an empire based in Constantinople, an Italy which can be taxed for the defence of the East and not defended from its own enemies because, well, the loss of Italy does not represent much of a threat to the empire as a whole. Instead, they want to be ruled by strong men nearer to home, and they would rather have Lombards than Greeks. So Constans retires to Italy, and a few years later he's murdered in some palace intrigue. He's in his bath and he's hit on the head with a bucket by his chamberlain. And that's the end of the last reconquest of Italy from Constantinople. Assimilation. Nothing unusual about this. By about 700, the Lombards, they've given up their own language, they've given up their own religion, they appear to have given up any customs that distinguish them from the other people of Italy. They have assimilated. They have become indistinguishable from other Italians, except by their names, except possibly by their lighter colouring, and sometimes by their recollection of their bloodlines leading back into the time before the Lombards came into Italy. A question about social class and assimilation. Yes, the Lombard upper classes, they become indistinguishable from the Italian upper classes, and the common people blend in anyway. Italy is much poorer, and it's much smaller in terms of population than it had been in the days of Theodoric, but it is still much richer and much more densely populated and much more urban than anywhere else in the West, much more so than in France or Spain, and much more so by far than in England. As you proceed across the Alps from France into Italy, you do perceive that you're entering a different and, in many respects, a superior kind of civilization. But there is no more of the late Roman imperial administration, and of course there is nothing like the imperial tax gatherers. The areas of Italy that remain under Byzantine rule are still subject to the imperial land tax, whereas there are very few taxes in the Lombard areas, but there is still a broadly centralised government. The kings do carry out certain judicial functions, and because of the continuing existence of cities and the continuing existence of a literate population outside the church, The Lombards are able to rule Italy through secular authorities rather than through the church. The surviving evidence shows that Italy around 750 has very much the kind of shape that you still see in Italy around 1500. The Renaissance has not yet started, though there is actually a Renaissance underway. There is now the recovery and the copying of ancient manuscripts and the beginning of new literary productions. Italy is taking on the shape that it will have until about 1500. Let's talk about the end of Lombard Italy. In 751, the Lombards finally take Ravenna. It's been on their list of things to do for nearly 200 years. The Lombards get into Ravenna and they bring the Byzantine Exarchate to an end. However, the Lombard kings then fall out with the popes over the booty. If I say Italian politics in this period are rather complex, I'm making, I think, a general comment about Italy. Italian politics are always complex, and you can apply to Italy what many people say about Ireland. If you think you understand what's going on, you don't know anything at all about it. The popes appear to have cooperated with the Lombards in bringing the Byzantine Exarchate to an end. They then fall out over the booty. The Pope is promised a number of cities in northern Italy. The Lombard kings say, no, you can't have that. The deal's off. We've got what we want and you're not getting what you want. And the Pope then calls on Charlemagne, the king of the Franks. He invades Italy and beats the Lombards. Not all of them. The Duchy of Spoleto and the Duchy of Benevento continue until about 1000 AD. They continue until the time of the First Crusade. But the Lombard kingdom in the north, Charlemagne takes that over. He declares himself the king of the Franks and of the Lombards. So he doesn't conquer the Lombards. What he does is he wins a few battles and becomes the king of the Lombards. There is a difference. That's not the end of the Lombards. It's not the end of the Lombards by any means. The Lombards don't go away. They're not driven out. They assimilate. They have assimilated. They have become Italians. They have now been conquered by Charlemagne from the north, and the north of Italy is and remains for a very long time. It remains until the 1860s, part of an imperial system based in Central Europe. It wasn't until the 1860s, was it, that the Austrians were driven out of northern Italy. But as I said, this is the end of the separate Lombard kingdom established by Alboin in 568. But it is not the end of the Lombards. It is easy to say that Italy is already on its course of progress that will culminate in the great days of the Renaissance. Perhaps this would have happened without the Lombard invasion, but there is no doubt that the Lombards contribute substantially to the mix that did become Italy. So I know it's a rather crude way of assessing the barbarian invasions to talk about winners and losers. The Ostrogoths in Italy are losers. The Vandals in Africa are losers. The Visigoths in Spain, they are losers. The Anglo-Saxons in England, they manifestly are winners. The Franks in France, they are winners. And the Lombards in Italy, somewhat unlikely, but they are winners as well. The point I wanted to make. Paul the Deacon says that when they arrive in northern Italy, the Lombards are terrifying people with tattooed faces. within a few generations, well, their grandchildren would look at pictures of the Lombards as they came into Italy and would put the pictures down with horror. They could not look on the faces of their ancestors without fear, because the Lombards were such scary people when they came into Italy. And the clear implication is that by the time you get to the time of Paul the Deacon, the Lombards have stopped being frightening. They are just Italians. So there it is. There's much more to say about the Lombards, but if you haven't read him, I do strongly recommend Paul the Deacon. He doesn't have the highest reputation as a medieval writer. That would go to Bede. If you want someone who writes Latin which is indistinguishable from that of the pagan classics, Bede is a good place to look. But Paul, he's a bit like Herodotus. He tells a series of wonderful and sometimes unlikely stories. But even when they're very unlikely, there's probably a great deal of truth in them. There's a little sprinkling of truth in the most unlikely of his stories. And the history is put together with enormous skill and general artistry. And Paul is a Lombard through and through, but he's also a Christian and an Italian and a master of Latin prose. So you can't talk about happy endings in the Middle Ages. It's not a period that lends itself to happy endings, but the Lombards in Italy do come pretty close to that. Okay, any questions? A further question about the Crown of Lombardy. It was made around 750, and I haven't quite finished. Let me have a look at this. We've got some Lombard art. There you go. Those are Lombard grave goods from the 6th and 7th centuries, which are interesting. They're in Milan. But that's outside our period from about 900. That is Lombard work from about 900. This is Lombard work from within our period. It's not very classical, but it is distinctive, isn't it? These are rather striking images, and this is from about 730. A marble slab from about 730. Touches of classicism there. Oh, and there's Grimoald III of Beneventum around 800 AD. And there's a great deal more in the way of Lombard art. If you go to Italy and look around, there's a great deal in the Vatican Museum. My regret is that the last time I was in Rome with time to look at the museums, I didn't look as closely at the Lombard period as I should have done. But there is a lot there. There's a lot remaining to be looked at. Indeed, I am glad that when my wife and I turned up in Rome for the first time many years ago, we did have we did give a rather languid inspection to the Forum and the Temple of Jupiter, or what's left of it. But we found ourselves increasingly, after the first afternoon, looking at churches from the 4th, 5th and 6th centuries, churches which are still standing and still in use, and then looking at other buildings from the Middle Ages. Those are still standing, they've still got their roofs on, they're still in use. They are almost completely overlooked. The Museum of Rome, we went in there and it was empty, and this is in what used to be the Venetian Embassy. It's a huge building filled with very pretty objects. So there's a lot in Rome which is pretty well undiscovered by tourists. I do have at least an obligation to like looking at ruined temples, but when you've seen one ruined temple of Apollo, how many more do you need to look at? Whereas looking at a functioning church which was built around 350, now that's something else. Rome is filled with such things, and they are not on the beaten track. One of these days we shall be allowed out of the country again, and when that happens I do plan to make my way to Italy and have a look at this stuff, because the number of my visits to Italy has not been as great as I would like them to have been. A question: is Paul the Deacon really writing with a specific agenda? He is an example of a completely assimilated barbarian. Although he apparently does know the Lombardic language, it's not a language in which he thought. His main language is whatever Latin was at this time. Latin is somewhere on its progress towards Italian, and that is the language that Paul speaks, and that is the language in which he thinks. Of course, he has an interest in believing and persuading other people that the Lombards have been providentially sent to Italy. He doesn't think of himself as an alien occupier. But then it seems that nobody thought that at the time. Antiquity is over. It's not like turning a light off. It's not like opening and closing a door. There is some point. The ancient world continues in Italy and the Mediterranean world for much longer than we assume, but it also does come to an end, and exactly when and how it comes to an end is controversial. You might argue for the period between about 535 and 568 in Italy, but there is no doubt that by the time Paul comes along, antiquity is over. The difference between the barbarian invaders and the natives in Italy has been abolished. The main difference now is between Italians and outsiders, or between Italians of various kinds. We are now into the Middle Ages. Indeed, although it still appears in university course outlines, when you talk about barbarian Europe, you may not be talking about a period that actually happened. There is the period of late antiquity, and then there is the early Middle Ages. They shade into each other. The barbarians are there at the end of antiquity, and they're there at the beginning of the Middle Ages. They make a substantial contribution, but to say that there is such a time in the Mediterranean world as barbarian Europe is probably not true. It's an illusion. Well, the Dark Ages don't exist. We know a great deal more about the so-called Dark Ages than we know about the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. We can construct a detailed narrative history of the Dark Ages. We know who the people were. In some cases, we have their signed manuscripts, whereas for the 3rd century of the Roman Empire, we're scrabbling around for evidence. It mostly doesn't exist. A question: how was Charlemagne seen by the Italians? And he was welcomed by the Pope and those who supported the Pope in the disputes with the Lombard kings. He was opposed by the Lombard kings and those who supported the Lombard kings. And then after he had beaten the Lombards and become King of Lombardy, he was accepted as a legitimate ruler. And once he became the Holy Roman Emperor, well, that is a different matter, isn't it? At what point the distinction between the barbarian invaders and the people they invaded broke down and became simply a matter of personal names is hard to say, but I do suspect it happened very early, within about 2 generations at the most. So it's not the fall of the Roman Empire, its destruction by barbarians. It is a transformation. It's a transformation that begins, I suppose, with the conversion to Christianity, then continues with the ending of a centralized unitary state in Italy, and continues with the growth of new nation states in medieval Europe, the most important of those nation states being France and England. The lecture comes to an abrupt end when I realise that I have 30 seconds to get to the next class.